May 1st, 305. A field outside Nicomedia, the gleaming capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. The air is thick with the metallic scent of thousands of soldiers' sweat, the smell of horse leather, and the dust kicked up by 100,000 hobnailed sandals. Upon a high tribunal stands a figure radiating an almost unbearable aura of power. Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus, Senior Augustus, restorer of the world, master of the Roman Empire for 21 years. He is dressed in the imperial purple, a color so sacred that to even possess a garment of it is a capital crime, and on his head is the radiant diadem of a Hellenistic king, a circlet of pearls and precious stones that declares him not a mere magistrate, but a living god on earth. The legions are assembled, their eagle standards glittering under the Anatolian sun, expecting a speech to launch another great campaign, another victory. Instead, a herald reads a declaration, and a stunned silence falls over the hardened soldiers, a silence deeper and more terrifying than the roar of battle. Diocletian, their god, their commander, their dominus, is voluntarily, inexplicably renouncing power. He is taking off the purple. The sensory assault is one of cognitive dissonance, the vision of absolute authority, the sound of utter disbelief. Men weep, they plead, they cannot comprehend. The machine that ruled the world is watching its own creator shut it down. This was the moment the world broke, not with the clash of steel, but with the quiet decision of one man. It is a scene so alien to the brutal logic of Roman power politics that it has echoed through history for nearly 17 centuries, a riddle wrapped in an imperial robe. To understand how a man could climb to the absolute pinnacle of human power, only to cast it aside for a vegetable garden, we must first understand the world of fire and blood that created him. This is the narrative of him, the son of a freedman from Dalmatia who became a god, the man who inherited a corpse of an empire and bequeathed it a new lease on life that would last, in the East, for another 1,000 years. This was the saga of an emperor who found Rome a wreck of brick and left it a fortress of iron and bureaucracy. But it is also, and more profoundly, the story of a paradox that lies at the very heart of power. Why? Why did the emperor who ruled the world, the Dominus Noster before whom all mortals prostrated themselves, the man who had stabilized a disintegrating civilization, choose to retire and cultivate cabbages? This is the core question, the central dramatic mystery of his reign. It was not a decision made in defeat or under duress. It was a conscious act at the very apex of his authority, a move so unprecedented it defied all logic of ambition and control. Was it weariness from decades of ceaseless war and administration? Was it a profound philosophical realization about the nature of power itself? Was it the bitter acknowledgement of a hidden failure, a crack in the very foundation of the glorious edifice he had constructed? To answer this question, we cannot simply look at the man. We must return to the world that spawned him, a world so broken, so steeped in chaos and despair, that it cried out not just for a leader, but for a messiah in military boots, a savior who would be forced to become a tyrant. The answer to the riddle of the Cabbages lies buried in the ruins of the century that preceded him. To understand this man, we must return to the world of the 3rd century, an era historians rightly call the crisis. It was not a crisis, it was the apocalypse. The Roman Empire, that vast multicultural edifice stretching from the mists of Britain to the sands of Mesopotamia, was not merely declining. It was disintegrating in a cataclysm of horrifying violence and systemic collapse. The sensory experience of this world was one of perpetual fear. The smell of smoke was a constant, as barbarian warbands, Goths, Franks, Alemanni, Quadi, poured across the Rhine and Danube frontiers, burning villas, sacking towns, and carrying off thousands into slavery. The sound of this era was the trumpet call of yet another usurper, another general declared emperor by his troops, marching on Rome to murder his predecessor. In a span of 50 years, between 235 and 284, there were more than 26 so-called barracks emperors, and all but one died violently, murdered by their own troops, killed in battle against other Romans, or assassinated by their court. The empire itself fractured. In the West, a Gallic empire arose, a vast breakaway state complete with its own emperors, senate, and legions. In the East, the glamorous desert queen Zenobia carved out the Palmyrene Empire, seizing control of Egypt, the breadbasket of Rome. This was the geopolitical chessboard, a three-headed monster, each part tearing at the others. And beneath this political chaos lay a deeper rot. The economy had imploded. The silver denarius, the bedrock of Roman commerce for centuries, was debased into a worthless copper token with a paper-thin silver wash. Hyperinflation made fortunes vanish overnight. And sweeping through it all was the plague of Cyprian, a pandemic that, by some estimates, killed up to 5,000 people a day in the city of Rome alone, leaving the living too few to bury the dead. This was the world that demanded a Diocletian, a failed state, a charnel house, a civilization on the brink of utter extinction. It was a world that could only be saved by a man as ruthless and as disciplined as the chaos he sought to conquer. Into this maelstrom of decay stepped a man not from the gilded halls of the Senate, not from the ancient patrician families who traced their lineage back to the Republic, but from the harsh, rocky soil of Dalmatia, the modern-day Balkans. He was born Diocles, and his origins were as humble as they come. His father was a scribe, a former slave in the household of a senator. This background is the key to his entire psychology. He was an outsider, a provincial, a man forged not in the philosophical debates of the Forum, but in the brutal, unforgiving crucible of the Roman army. His world was the legionary camp, the smell of boiled leather and cheap wine, the endless drills under a punishing sun, the coarse camaraderie of soldiers, and the absolute necessity of discipline and loyalty for survival. This was the ultimate meritocracy. Your name did not matter. Your wealth did not matter. All that mattered was your strength, your courage, and your ability to follow and give orders. Diocles rose through the ranks on sheer competence. He was a gifted cavalryman, a strategist, a quartermaster, a man who understood the vast, complex logistics of keeping the Roman war machine running. While the aristocrats in Rome played their deadly political games, Diocles was on the frontiers, learning the hard truths of the empire. He saw firsthand the consequences of weak leadership, of divided command, of the rot of corruption. He understood, in his very bones, that the old system was dead. It had failed. The Republic was a ghost, and the elegant compromise of the early Principate, where the emperor was merely the first citizen, was a polite fiction that could no longer be sustained. His character was forged in this furnace of practicality. He was not a man of grand theories, but of grim realities. He was intelligent, but his intelligence was organizational, systematic, and utterly devoid of sentimentality. He was a soldier who looked at the broken empire not as a politician would, but as a general would, as a shattered legion that needed its discipline restored, its ranks refilled, and its command structure rebuilt from the ground up, under a single, unquestionable authority. The moment this obscure Illyrian soldier stepped from the shadows of history onto the center stage was pure, unadulterated theater, a scene dripping with high drama and the scent of cold-blooded ambition. The year was 284. The Emperor Carus had died mysteriously on campaign in Persia, supposedly struck by lightning, a tale so convenient it was immediately suspect. His son, the young Emperor Numerian, was leading the army back from the east when he was found dead in his closed litter, his body already putrefying. The stench of death hung heavy over the camp, but it was the stench of conspiracy that was truly suffocating. Suspicion immediately fell upon the Praetorian prefect, Arrius Aper, Numerian's father-in-law, a man of immense power and ambition who had concealed the emperor's death for days. A tribunal of generals and officers convened on the plains outside Nicomedia, and they made a fateful choice. They bypassed Aper and proclaimed their own commander, Diocles, the head of the elite imperial bodyguard, as the new Augustus. Diocles ascended the tribunal, his face an impassive mask. He swore a solemn oath to the gods that he was innocent of Numerian's death. Then, pointing his sword at the prefect Aper, he declared him the murderer. Before Aper could even profess his innocence, Diocles, in one fluid motion, drew his blade and plunged it into the prefect's heart, killing him in front of the entire, stunned army. The chroniclers report that as he did so, he quoted Virgil, crying out, "Glory in this, Aper, you have been killed by the great Aeneas." It was a shocking act of summary execution, a brutal seizure of power. But it was also a masterstroke of political theater. He had not only eliminated his chief rival, but had also, according to legend, fulfilled a prophecy given to him by a Druid priestess years before, that he would become emperor after he had slain a boar, Aper in Latin. In that single bloody moment, Diocles showed the world the kind of man he was, decisive, ruthless, and with a keen understanding that in a world of chaos, power does not belong to those who ask for it, but to those who seize it with a bloody sword. He was no longer Diocles. He was now the Emperor Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus, and his war on chaos had just begun. Every great historical figure is driven by a hidden engine, an inner demon or a sacred motivation that fuels their ambition. For Alexander, it was the burning desire to surpass his father and conquer the known world. For Caesar, it was a hunger for glory, for dignitas. For Diocletian, it was something far more abstract, yet infinitely more powerful, an obsessive, all-consuming quest for order. His secret motivation was not the pursuit of personal wealth or fame, but a deep-seated, visceral terror of the chaos he had witnessed throughout his life. He saw the broken empire of the 3rd century not as a political problem, but as a flaw in the universe, a state of cosmic disharmony that had to be rectified. This wasn't the ambition of a politician. It was the obsession of a master engineer who sees a flawed machine and feels a compulsive need to strip it down, redesign it, and rebuild it so it can never break again. His inner demon was the specter of civil war, the ghost of another murdered emperor, the shadow of another barbarian horde crossing the frontier. To defeat this demon, he believed the empire needed a new soul. It needed to be remade into a perfect, hierarchical, and predictable system. He sought a world where succession was not determined by a bloody free-for-all, but by a clear and orderly process. A world where the frontiers were secure not by the luck of a single brilliant general, but by a rational division of military command. A world where the economy was stable, The currency was sound, and every citizen knew their place and their duty within the grand machine of the state. This philosophy of the system over the individual is what separated him from his predecessors. He was perhaps the first Roman emperor who did not see the empire as his personal property, but saw himself as the chief servant of the state, the high priest of order. This relentless drive for systemic perfection would lead to his greatest triumphs, the restoration of the empire, and also to his most terrible cruelties and his ultimate paradoxical decision. He was a man willing to sacrifice anything, including, eventually, himself, for the sake of the machine he was building. One of Diocletian's first and most revolutionary acts was a profound admission of a simple truth. The Roman Empire had become too large, too complex, and too beset by enemies for any single man to govern effectively. The age of the solitary Augustus was over. This realization was not born of weakness, but of a soldier's clear-eyed pragmatism. He needed a partner, a second fist to strike his enemies while he managed the grand strategy. His choice fell upon an old friend from the Illyrian officer corps, a man named Maximian. This was his fateful encounter, the alliance that would form the bedrock of his new world order. Maximian was everything Diocletian was not. Where Diocletian was a calculating strategist, a master administrator, and a reserved, almost remote personality, Maximian was a bull of a man, a brilliant, ferocious general, possessed of immense physical energy, but also crude, uncultured, and politically unsophisticated. He was the perfect instrument, utterly loyal, militarily effective, and possessing no ambition to usurp his senior partner's role as the supreme architect. In 286, Diocletian elevated Maximian to the rank of co-emperor, co-Augustus. Thus was born the Diarchy, the rule of two. To cement this new order and ideology, they assumed divine titles. Diocletian became Iovius, identifying himself with Jupiter, the king of the gods, the thinker, the planner. Maximian became Herculeus, identifying himself with Hercules, the demigod of tireless labor, the doer, the enforcer. The message was clear. This was not merely a political arrangement. It was a reflection of the cosmic order. Together, the mind of Jupiter and the muscle of Hercules would cleanse the world of chaos. Diocletian took responsibility for the strategic, wealthier East, while Maximian was dispatched to the troubled West to deal with the rebellions in Gaul and the constant pressure on the Rhine frontier. This division of labor was a stroke of genius. It allowed the empire to fight a war on two fronts simultaneously, and it began the process of transforming the emperorship from a single person into an institution, an office that could be shared. It was the first crucial step in building his immortal machine. The first decade of the Diarchy was a baptism by fire, an unrelenting, globe-spanning struggle to simply hold the crumbling empire together. This was the brutal price of power, paid in the currency of blood and iron on a dozen different fronts. The narrative of this period is not one of grand, decisive battles, but of a grim, attritional war of extermination against the forces of chaos, a ceaseless campaign to cauterize the wounds of the 3rd century. While Diocletian, the master strategist, secured the Danube frontier, battling the Sarmatians and Goths in a series of punishing campaigns, he dispatched his partner, Maximian, the Herculean enforcer, to the west. Maximian's task was a Herculean labor indeed. He first had to crush the Bagaudai in Gaul, a desperate uprising of peasants and deserters driven to banditry by decades of oppressive taxation and war. He hunted them down with ruthless efficiency, restoring the authority of the landowners and the state. Then, he turned his legions to the Rhine, pushing back successive waves of Germanic tribes, the Alemanni, the Burgundians, the Heruli, who sought to plunder the rich provinces of Gaul. The sensory experience of these years was one of endless marching. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer repairing armor, the smoke of burning barbarian villages, and the chilling silence of resettled, depopulated lands. It was a war of frontiers, of building new forts, of punitive expeditions deep into enemy territory. At the same time, Diocletian was forced to campaign in the east, quelling a rebellion in Egypt and fighting Saracen tribes along the desert frontier. It was a testament to the genius of the dual emperor system that they managed to prevent the state from collapsing under these immense, simultaneous pressures. They were racing along the ramparts of a burning fortress, extinguishing fires just as new ones erupted. This was not yet about restoration. It was about survival, and the price of that survival was a militarization of society on a scale never seen before. The empire was being transformed into a vast armed camp, and its rulers were not politicians, but grim-faced warlords. The primary antagonist of Diocletian's reign was not a single person or nation, but the hydra of chaos itself, the tendency of the overstretched empire to fly apart under pressure. This amorphous threat, however, was personified by two major concrete adversaries that represented the existential dangers at the opposite ends of the Roman world. In the West, the enemy was internal fragmentation, embodied by the rogue admiral Carausius. In a stunning act of defiance, Carausius, the commander of the Roman fleet tasked with clearing the English Channel of pirates, had instead allied with them, seized control of Britain and a strip of northern Gaul, and declared himself emperor. This was the nightmare of the 3rd century reborn. The new Britannic Empire was a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the Diarchy, a wealthy and strategically vital province torn away from the whole. It was a symbol of the centrifugal forces that Diocletian was fighting to suppress. Meanwhile, in the east, the empire faced a far more formidable external foe, the Sasanian Persian Empire. The Sasanians were not a barbarian horde, but a sophisticated, centralized state, a rival superpower with a professional army and an ideology that saw itself as the rightful heir to the ancient Persian glory of Cyrus and Darius. Their king, or Shahanshah, king of kings, was an equal to the Roman Augustus. This was a clash of civilizations, a struggle for dominance over the crucial territories of Mesopotamia and Armenia. The Persian threat was existential. A major defeat in the east could unravel the entire Roman position in the Levant and beyond. These two antagonists, the internal usurper in Britain and the external superpower in Persia, perfectly encapsulated the dilemma Diocletian faced. He had to quell rebellion from within and repel invasion from without, simultaneously. The Hydra had many heads, and cutting one off often seemed to cause two more to grow in its place. The pressure was immense, and it would soon lead to a crisis that would push Diocletian toward an even more radical solution. Even the most well-designed machine can suffer a critical failure. For Diocletian, that moment of near catastrophe came in the year 296, during the war against the Sasanian Empire, and it served as a profound psychological breaking point. By this time, Diocletian had already expanded the diarchy into the Tetrarchy, appointing 2 junior emperors, or Caesars, to serve under the 2 senior Augusti. To his Caesar in the east, the ambitious and fiery Galerius, fell the task of confronting the Persian king Narse, who had invaded Roman Armenia. Galerius, rash and overconfident, rushed into battle with a small force near Callinicum in Mesopotamia and suffered a swift and humiliating defeat. He was forced to flee for his life, abandoning his army and the province to the enemy. The news was a thunderclap, a terrifying echo of the defeats that had plagued Rome for the past century, like the capture of the Emperor Valerian by a previous Persian king. For Diocletian, this was more than a military setback. It was a deep personal and systemic failure. The chroniclers tell a powerful story of the aftermath. When Galerius finally met Diocletian, the senior Augustus did not greet him as a colleague. Instead, he forced his disgraced junior emperor, still clad in his imperial purple, to walk for a full mile in front of the imperial chariot, in full view of the soldiers, an act of profound public humiliation. In this moment, Diocletian the man was subsumed by Diocletian the system builder. The message was brutal and clear. Failure was not an option. Personal feelings were irrelevant. The health and honor of the state were absolute. This catastrophe seared a lesson into Diocletian's mind, that even his chosen partners, the hand-picked cogs in his imperial machine, were fallible. The system needed to be stronger, the hierarchy more rigid, and the authority of the senior Augustus more absolute and terrifyingly divine. The failure of his subordinate did not cause him to question the system itself, but rather to double down on it, to make it even more monolithic and unassailable. True genius often reveals itself not in preventing crises, but in using them as opportunities for transformation. The chaos of the 3rd century and the near disaster of Galerius's initial defeat in Persia did not break Diocletian. Instead, they served as the catalyst for his greatest political innovation, the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. He had already understood that 2 emperors were better than 1. Now he concluded that 4 were better than 2. In the year 293, he unveiled his master plan to save the Roman world. He and Maximian, the 2 senior Augusti, would each adopt a junior emperor, a Caesar. These Caesars would be their designated heirs, and would also be given command over vast territories of their own. Diocletian chose Galerius as his Caesar in the east, stationing him on the dangerous Danube frontier. In the west, Maximian adopted the capable and respected general Constantius Chlorus, who was given the immediate task of reconquering the breakaway empire of Britain from the usurper Carausius and his successor Electus. The structure was a work of organizational brilliance, a 4-headed imperial college designed to solve the 2 terminal diseases that had afflicted the Roman state: administration and succession. Geographically, it divided the empire's immense military and administrative burdens into 4 manageable quadrants. Politically, it created a clear line of succession. When the senior Augusti retired or died, the Caesars would be elevated, and they in turn would appoint new Caesars. In theory, this would eliminate the bloody civil wars that had followed the death of nearly every emperor for a century. The empire was no longer a personal possession to be fought over, but a public utility to be managed by a board of directors. To bind this new system together with ideological glue, family ties were created. Galerius married Diocletian's daughter, Valeria, and Constantius was forced to divorce his wife, Helena, to marry Maximian's stepdaughter. The Tetrarchy was a family, a divine household destined to rule the world forever. It was Diocletian's ultimate triumph of logic and order over the bloody, chaotic passions of human ambition. The ultimate vindication of the tetrarchic system, the moment that proved the genius of Diocletian's machine, was the glorious and overwhelming victory against the Sasanian Empire. After his initial, humiliating defeat, the Caesar Galerius was given a new army, reinforced with veterans from the Danube legions, and sent back to confront King Narsa. This time, there would be no mistake. Learning his lesson, Galerius utilized speed, surprise, and local knowledge. In 298, he launched a daring surprise attack on the Persian camp in Armenia under the cover of night. The result was not just a victory, it was an annihilation. The Persian army was scattered, King Narse himself was wounded and forced to flee, and most importantly, the Romans captured the entire royal encampment. This was a prize beyond measure. The Shah's treasury, his state papers, and critically, his entire harem, including his wives, sisters, and children. The capture of the royal family was a blow to Persian prestige from which Narse would never recover. He was forced to the negotiating table, where a triumphant Galerius, with Diocletian's guidance, imposed a peace treaty overwhelmingly favorable to Rome. The Persians ceded vast territories in Mesopotamia and Armenia, effectively creating a new, highly defensible frontier that would keep the peace for 40 years. In 303, to celebrate 2 decades of his rule and this monumental victory, Diocletian visited the city of Rome for the only time in his reign. He and Maximian celebrated a magnificent triumph, the last such parade a Roman emperor would ever hold in the ancient capital. The streets were thronged with cheering crowds as the emperors, followed by floats displaying captured Persian treasures and exotic animals, paraded to the capital. This was the absolute apex of Diocletian's power. His system had been tested by the greatest foreign power on earth, and it had emerged completely victorious. The world was at peace, the frontiers were secure, and the Hydra of chaos seemed at last to have been slain. The restorer of the world had completed his task. At the moment of his greatest triumph, a subtle but profound transformation in Diocletian's presentation of power became complete. This was his psychological summit, his moment of hubris, where the practical soldier emperor fully metamorphosed into a remote, divine monarch. He ceased to be a man and became an icon. The title he adopted, Dominus Noster, our Lord, was not merely a formality, it was a statement of a new political theology. He was no longer the princeps, the first citizen, who ruled with the theoretical consent of the Senate, like Augustus. He was the Dominus, the absolute master whose authority was a gift from the gods, and whose will was law. To underscore this new reality, he systematically dismantled the last vestiges of republican tradition and imported the elaborate court ceremonial of the Sasanian monarchy he had just defeated. Access to the emperor became almost impossible. He lived in the secluded heart of a vast palace, surrounded by a legion of bureaucrats and eunuchs. Those few who were granted an audience were required to perform the proskinesis, a ritual of prostration where they had to lie face down on the floor and kiss the hem of his purple robes. He wore the diadem, a white ribbon inlaid with pearls, a symbol of royalty abhorrent to old Roman sensibilities. His robes were woven with gold, and his shoes were studded with precious gems. This was not just about personal vanity, it was a calculated political strategy. By elevating the emperor to a divine status, he was lifting the office above the bloody fray of military politics. A remote, godlike figure was harder to assassinate. An attack on the emperor was no longer just murder, it was sacrilege. In his own mind, he was not indulging in tyranny, but cementing the stability of the state. He saw his own divinity as the final, necessary component of his machine of order. He was the living incarnation of Jupiter on earth, and his rule was a reflection of the unshakable order of the heavens. It was a logical but ultimately fatal step in his quest for total control. In the perfectly ordered, divinely sanctioned world that Diocletian was constructing, there could be no room for dissent, no alternative source of loyalty. and in the heart of his empire, he perceived a sworn enemy, a state within his state that threatened the very foundations of his ideological project: the Christians. His conflict with Christianity was not, at its core, a matter of personal religious bigotry. It was a clash of two mutually exclusive totalitarian systems. To Diocletian, the Roman state was a complete entity that commanded the total loyalty of its subjects in all aspects of life, including the religious. The traditional Roman cults, the worship of Jupiter, Apollo, and the divine emperor himself, were not just a matter of faith. They were a civic duty, the spiritual cement that held the diverse peoples of the empire together in a bond of shared reverence or concordia. The Christians, however, were fundamentally different. They possessed their own hierarchical structure of bishops and priests, their own system of law and charity, and their own sacred texts. Most dangerously, they had their own king, a heavenly sovereign to whom they gave their ultimate allegiance. Their refusal to offer a pinch of incense before a statue of the emperor was, in Diocletian's eyes, not an act of private conscience, but an act of blatant sedition and treason. They were a foreign body in his perfectly regulated machine, a pocket of resistance that refused to be integrated. For years he had tolerated them, but as his vision of a divine, monolithic state grew more absolute, their existence became an intolerable contradiction. The Caesar Galerius, a fervent pagan, constantly whispered in his ear, warning him that the army was being corrupted by this pacifist, insubordinate cult. The Christians represented chaos, the one element of society that he could not systematize, could not control. They were his ideological sworn enemy, and in his quest for total unity, a final terrible confrontation was becoming inevitable. While fighting wars and remaking the ideology of the empire, Diocletian the administrator was engaged in an equally monumental, if less glamorous, project: the complete overhaul of the Roman state's internal machinery. He was a tireless, obsessive reformer, a man who believed that any problem could be solved with a sufficiently detailed and rigidly enforced system. This was his attempt to forge what historians now call the dominate, an openly autocratic state built on a vast, centralized bureaucracy. His most ambitious reform was a complete restructuring of the tax system, called the capitatio iugatio. He sought to replace the chaotic and corrupt old system with a predictable universal tax based on units of land, iuga, and labor, capita, whether human or animal. In theory, it was a brilliant and equitable system that would allow for precise annual budgets. In practice, it was often brutal and inflexible, binding peasants to their land and creating a rigid, caste-like society. He also dramatically reorganized the provinces, breaking the large old ones into nearly 100 smaller, more manageable units, which were then grouped into 12 large administrative districts called dioceses, ruled by officials called vicars. This separated civil and military authority, making it harder for powerful governors to launch rebellions. But perhaps his most famous reform was his Edict on Maximum Prices, issued in 301. In a desperate attempt to combat runaway hyperinflation, Diocletian fixed the prices for thousands of goods and services, from wheat and eggs to wages for laborers and lawyers, with the death penalty for violators. The sensory experience of this edict was one of pure economic chaos. Goods vanished from the market, to be sold on the black market at much higher prices. Riots erupted. It was a catastrophic failure, a powerful lesson that even the will of a god emperor could not defy the basic laws of supply and demand. It was a crack in his armor of omniscience, a hint that some forms of chaos could not be tamed by imperial decree. As Diocletian remade the empire, he also shifted its center of gravity. The city of Rome, for 1,000 years the heart of the world, was becoming a magnificent irrelevance. It was too far from the critical frontier zones where the emperors now spent all their time. The Senate was a powerless debating society. Diocletian, in a profound strategic shift, established a series of new imperial capitals, tetrarchic headquarters closer to the action. He himself ruled from the opulent city of Nicomedia in Asia Minor, a perfect base to watch both the Danube frontier and the Persian threat. Maximian held court in Mediolanum, modern Milan, in Italy, guarding the Alpine passes. Constantius was based in Augusta Treverorum, Trier, in Germany, close to the Rhine, while Galerius resided in Sirmium, Sremska Mitrovica, in Serbia, the linchpin of the Balkan defenses. This was a physical manifestation of his new order, a decentralized empire run by a mobile, military command structure. Rome was now a museum, a symbol, but no longer the engine of power. This pragmatic logic also extended to his own family life, which was entirely subsumed by the needs of the state. He was married to a woman named Prisca and had a daughter, Valeria. In a deeply ironic twist of fate, both women were rumored to be, if not baptized Christians, at least deeply sympathetic to the faith. This created a silent, hidden tension at the very heart of the imperial court. While Diocletian was moving towards a policy of brutal suppression, the two most important women in his life may have been part of the very community he was about to declare his mortal enemy. This onion layer of context reveals the profound personal stakes involved. His quest for ideological purity was not an abstract political calculation. It was a conflict that would tear through his own household, forcing his wife and daughter to choose between their faith and their survival. A stark illustration of how his monolithic system crushed all personal loyalties beneath its weight. Despite the triumphs and the monumental reforms, by the early years of the 4th century, the first serious cracks began to appear in Diocletian's grand edifice. The machine, for all its power, was beginning to show signs of strain. The economic reforms, particularly the edict on maximum prices, had been a spectacular and public failure, proving that the emperor's will was not, in fact, absolute. The new tax system, while rational, was crushingly oppressive. Its relentless efficiency created widespread resentment among all classes, from small farmers to city aristocrats. The cost of maintaining the vastly expanded army and the swarms of new bureaucrats was bleeding the empire dry. A sense of sullen discontent began to bubble beneath the surface of enforced stability. But the most significant harbinger of the coming storm was the intensifying ideological war against the Christians. The Caesar Galerius, whose pagan convictions were as fervent as his military ambitions, relentlessly pressured Diocletian to take decisive action. He saw the Christians' refusal to join the army in large numbers and their rejection of the state gods as a mortal threat to military discipline and the spiritual health of the empire. Omens and portents were interpreted as signs of divine displeasure with Christian impiety. An incident where the oracle of Apollo at Didyma was supposedly rendered mute by the presence of Christians was used as a powerful piece of propaganda. The atmosphere in the court at Nicomedia grew thick with paranoia and religious fervor. Diocletian, a man who craved order and unity above all else, found himself increasingly swayed by these arguments. He saw the Christians as the final obstacle to achieving his dream of a perfectly harmonious, unified state. The stage was being set for a final, terrible act of purification, a decision that would stain his legacy forever and, ironically, reveal the ultimate limits of his power. On the 23rd of February, 303, a date chosen to coincide with the Roman festival of the Terminalia, the god of boundaries, Diocletian made the fateful decision that would define his reign for posterity. He unleashed the great persecution. On his orders, the magnificent new church in Nicomedia, which stood in sight of the imperial palace, was torn down by Praetorian guards. The next day, the first edict was published. It was universal and merciless. All Christian churches were to be destroyed, all sacred scriptures were to be burned, and Christians were stripped of all legal rights and honors. Subsequent edicts would call for the arrest of all clergy, and finally demand that every man, woman, and child in the empire make a public sacrifice to the Roman gods on pain of torture and death. The psychology behind this act was the terrible, cold logic of a true believer in a system. After nearly 2 decades of rebuilding the empire's body, Diocletian had become convinced it was time to save its soul. He did not see this as an act of wanton cruelty, but as a necessary, if painful, surgery to remove a cancerous tumor from the body politic. He genuinely believed that the state could not survive if a significant portion of its population gave its ultimate allegiance to an authority other than the emperor. It was the culmination of his life's work, the imposition of absolute concordia, or harmony, by force. He had standardized the currency, the taxes, and the administration. Now he would standardize belief. It was a profound miscalculation, born of the hubris that his rational, top-down systems could re-engineer not just society, but the human spirit itself. He fatally underestimated the passion and conviction of the very people he sought to eliminate. He thought he was enforcing a boundary, but he was instead starting a fire that would consume his own legacy and forge a new world. The Great Persecution was Diocletian's greatest catastrophe, not a military defeat, but a profound moral and political disaster that shattered the ideological foundations of his reign. The sensory experience of these years was one of horror and defiance. The smell of burning books and incense filled the town squares. The sounds were the screams of the tortured in the arenas and the quiet prayers of believers meeting in secret catacombs. The persecution was incredibly brutal, especially in the East under the zealous direction of Galerius. But it failed. It failed utterly. For every Christian who recanted in fear, another was inspired to martyrdom, their public and often gruesome deaths serving not as a deterrent, but as a powerful act of witness that drew more converts to the faith. The state, for all its immense power, discovered it could command a man's body, but it could not command his soul. This ideological defeat was a stunning blow to the God-Emperor, who believed his will was absolute. For the first time, Diocletian had encountered an enemy he could not intimidate, could not crush, could not systematically eliminate. As this spiritual crisis reached its peak, his body, which had endured decades of ceaseless campaigning, finally broke. In late 304, after returning from his triumph in Rome, he contracted a mysterious and severe illness. He lingered for months, hidden away in his palace in Nicomedia, so sick he was often presumed dead. The invincible Iovius, the earthly Jupiter, was reduced to a frail, suffering mortal. The machine he had built to run the world ground to a halt, paralyzed by the incapacity of its creator. The physical collapse mirrored the collapse of his ideological project. The man who had sought to purge the empire of what he saw as its weakness was now confronted, in the most intimate and terrifying way, with his own. The collapse was total, both physical and psychological. Diocletian's year-long illness in 304 and 305 was the crucible that finalized his unprecedented decision. The chronicler Lactantius, a Christian and thus a hostile source, but a contemporary witness, describes the emperor as a broken man, intermittently insane, a shadow of his former self. For almost a year, the most powerful man in the world simply vanished. The immense imperial bureaucracy he had created, the machine designed for perpetual motion, was suddenly without its prime mover. The empire held its breath. Galerius, his ambitious Caesar, circled like a vulture, arriving in Nicomedia and waiting impatiently for the old man to die so he could seize the senior position and appoint his own cronies as the new Caesars. This was the ultimate irony. Diocletian had designed the Tetrarchy to prevent a succession crisis, yet the first succession was threatening to devolve into the very chaos he had sought to eliminate, all because he himself was the weak link. It was in the depths of this illness, in the silent darkness of his sick room, that Diocletian must have confronted the fundamental flaw in his own creation. The system was not, in fact, independent of the man. His own mortality, his own physical frailty, was the greatest threat to its stability. He, the divine architect, had become the ghost in his own machine. To save the system, to give it one last chance to function as he had designed it, he would have to do the unthinkable. He would have to remove himself. The decision to abdicate, which had been planned for his 20th anniversary but delayed, now became an urgent necessity. He had to prove, both to the world and to himself, that his creation could outlive him. It was his last, desperate gamble to secure his life's work against the chaos of human ambition and the finality of death. After his shocking abdication, Diocletian retired to a place he had prepared for years, a colossal, fortress-like palace built on the shores of his native Dalmatia, near the town of Salona, the modern city of Split in Croatia. This was not a simple retirement villa. It was a microcosm of his life's work, a massive, obsessively organized structure, half military camp, half luxurious palace, surrounded by immense walls. Here, the man who had ruled the world dedicated himself to a new, more tranquil occupation: gardening. He famously cultivated vegetables, particularly cabbages. The world, however, did not leave him in peace. The tetrarchic system, his beautiful, logical machine, had almost immediately torn itself apart. Upon his and Maximian's abdication, a new civil war had erupted, a complex, multi-sided conflict involving no fewer than 6 rival emperors, including Constantine and Maxentius. The order he had spent 21 years building had dissolved back into the familiar Roman chaos. At one point, in the year 308, a conference of the remaining tetrarchs was held at Carnuntum. His old colleague Maximian, who had reluctantly abdicated and then tried to reclaim power, was there. They pleaded with Diocletian to return, to take up the purple once more, and restore order to the broken state. They begged him to save the world again. His reply, as recorded by history, is the perfect epilogue to his entire life. He rejected their pleas, saying, "If you could show the cabbage that I planted with my own hands to your emperor, he definitely would not dare suggest that I replace the peace and quiet of this place with the storms of a never-satisfied greed." It was the ultimate statement of his disillusionment. The grand political machine was a source of endless, stormy strife. The simple, organic act of cultivating a garden offered a peace and satisfaction that ruling the world never could. The finale of his life was not a tragedy, but a quiet, philosophical victory. He had found a kingdom in a garden patch. The legacy of Diocletian is a study in profound and irreconcilable contradictions, a conflict of interpretations that rages to this day. For centuries, the dominant narrative, written by Christian historians like Eusebius and Lactantius, painted him as a one-dimensional villain, a monstrous tyrant, the personification of the Antichrist, who presided over the most savage persecution the Church had ever known. In this version of history, he is the Dark Lord against whom the heroic Constantine, the first Christian emperor, would triumph. He was the final, dying gasp of a pagan world, a cruel beast whose failure was a sign of God's divine favor for the new faith. Yet, a completely opposite interpretation exists, one articulated by pagan historians of the time and revived by modern scholars. In this view, Diocletian was nothing less than the savior of Roman civilization, the restitutor orbis, the restorer of the world. They point to the undeniable fact that he inherited a state in a terminal state of collapse, and, through sheer force of will and administrative genius, stabilized it. The very reforms he instituted, the division of the empire, the expansion of the army, the creation of a mobile field army, and the strengthening of the central bureaucracy, were the foundation upon which Constantine would build his own empire. Ironically, the strong, centralized state that allowed Christianity to flourish and become the official religion of the empire was the very state that Diocletian had forged. The Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire that would survive for another 1,000 years, was, in its administrative and military DNA, a direct descendant of Diocletian's dominate. He was both the persecutor of the faith and the architect of the state that would ensure its triumph. He is a monster and a savior, a failure and a visionary, a man whose legacy is forever caught between the hagiography of his enemies and the cold, hard facts of political survival. So we return to the core question, the central paradox. Why did the man who saved the world, who held absolute power in his hands, retire to grow cabbages? The final, comprehensive answer is that his abdication was not a single act, but the confluence of three powerful forces. Firstly, it was the ultimate logical expression of his entire political philosophy. He was a radical systems thinker who believed the state, the machine, was more important than any one man. He had designed the Tetrarchy to be a self-perpetuating system of orderly succession. The only way to prove his creation worked, to force it to stand on its own, was to remove its creator. His abdication was the final, terrifyingly logical test of his own life's work. Secondly, it was a profound admission of personal failure and exhaustion. His brutal persecution of the Christians had failed to achieve its objective. He, the man of absolute order, could not control the chaos of the human spirit. This ideological defeat, combined with the devastating physical collapse from his year-long illness, broke him. The invincible living God was forced to confront his own mortality and his own limitations. He had poured every ounce of his energy for 2 decades into his project, and he was simply, humanly, worn out. But thirdly, and perhaps most profoundly, his retirement was a philosophical choice. Having experienced the absolute pinnacle of human power, he found it wanting. He had seen that the storms of a never-satisfied greed that defined political life were a source of endless anxiety and strife. In the simple, predictable, organic cycle of planting, cultivating, and harvesting, he found a form of order, a natural, divine order, that was more real and more satisfying than the artificial, brutal order he had tried to impose upon the world. He did not retire out of weakness. He retired because he had learned a truth that no other emperor had: that true peace cannot be found on a throne, but only in a garden. The verdict of history on Diocletian is a timeless and universal lesson about the nature of power and the limits of control. His life is the ultimate parable of the benevolent technocrat, the master organizer who believes that human society can be perfected if only it is subjected to a sufficiently rational and powerful system. He was a man who genuinely sought to save civilization, but the price of his salvation was freedom. In his relentless pursuit of order, he created a rigid, hierarchical, and oppressive state that crushed the individual under the weight of the collective. He demonstrates the eternal temptation of the strong leader. To believe that unity can be imposed by force, that dissent is a disease to be cured, and that a perfect system can eliminate the messy, unpredictable, and often chaotic reality of human nature. His ultimate failure in the Great Persecution is a testament to the indestructible power of faith and conviction. He proved that you can build walls, reform taxes, and command legions, but you cannot legislate the soul. His story is a profound meditation on the clash, not just between paganism and Christianity, but between two visions of the world as a machine to be engineered, and the world as a garden to be cultivated. He tried to build the perfect machine, only to discover in the end that true contentment lay in the simple, humble act of working the earth. His life serves as a permanent warning that any system that does not leave room for the irrational, the spiritual, and the free is ultimately doomed to become a prison, even for its own architect. The final frame is not of the god-emperor on his throne, but of the old man in his palace at Salona, a fortress by the sea. The storms of civil war rage outside his walls, as the very men he appointed tear his beautiful system to shreds in their lust for power. The world he saved is once again descending into chaos, but inside the walls, there is a profound and unshakable peace. We see him walking through his vegetable beds, the Adriatic sun warming his old bones. He bends down, his hands, which once held the fate of millions, now touching the soil. He inspects a row of cabbages, their leaves unfurling in the sunlight. In this single, simple image lies the entire story. The purple robe has been exchanged for a plain tunic. The divine diadem has been replaced by the sweat on a gardener's brow. The roar of the adoring legions has been supplanted by the whisper of the sea breeze. This is the shadow of the man who rebuilt the world, a man who discovered that the power to create life in a small patch of earth was more meaningful than the power of death he had once wielded over an entire empire. The fire he had used to reforge Rome was a fleeting, destructive thing, but the quiet, persistent, life-giving energy of the sun on his garden, that was eternal.